Well, good morning. Sorry I couldn't be with you today, but Dorothy and I are down in Colorado City. Scott's with us as well, and we're there over the weekend, like right now, and come back Monday. But I didn't want to do a shortened version of our Old Testament memes today. The next step is actually talking about bread, but what I wanted to do instead today was just to throw in kind of a little extra topic. It sort of relates to our whole Old Testament memes thing, and it actually relates till next week's topic on bread, and that's in terms of things that are essential and necessary. And so I thought I'd bring you just like a little 10-minute message as I'm sitting out here next to the Brigham City pool. And the reason I'm here, it's for a good purpose, because what I want to talk about is one of my favorite verses from Jeremiah 2, and it talks about issues of dependence and independence. Dependence on God and independence on God, from God. It sort of harkens back to the entire story of the prodigal son. And so we have the prodigal son who clearly yearns to be independent of the father, and that's not a good way to live. And this comes up in Jeremiah 2. But we have to do a setup for this, because the issue he's going to use is actually another Old Testament meme that we don't know much about, and that's the Old Testament meme of cisterns. Boy, a lot of traffic out here today. So a cistern is a man-made water storage system, a lot like the pool here at Brigham City. In fact, let's get a better view of the pool here. If you come around here, you'll see the Brigham City pool. The Brigham City pool is about 750,000 gallons of water. It's a man-made water storage system, but instead of being there for water for us to drink, it's really there as a way to have recreation. But in ancient times, it was not about recreation when they made cisterns. A man-made water system was really there in order to stave off the potential dangers of running out of water in a drought. And it was a pretty common thing in old times. Often you would situate where you live based on a stream of water, you know, like a Nile or something like that, something that flowed all the time. But in drier places, like in Israel, that wasn't always possible to do. So what they would do is they would dig big pits in the ground that would hold water. The issue, though, is that the water that they held wasn't always, how do I put it? Not always just rainwater. That rainwater is the best because it's actually purified by evaporation. But they would dig these pits and they'd fill them with water, and then throughout the year, if the water came and went, now we got trains. He'll be through in a second. He's coming through there. That's loud. So let's get back to cisterns. Cisterns are a way of storing that water, and in times of drought, you'll be able to draw from them. Now, cisterns also are something that only really rich people can afford. People like Herod, government officials, stuff like that, they would make these things. And in fact, let's talk about Herod for a second, because Herod was one of the most famous builders in the Middle East, and he built some extraordinary structures, and one of the things he built was like a summer residence that he built in Masada. Now Masada is like, well, in Western terms we'd call it a butte in a way. It was a big rock butte that sticks up on the western side of the Dead Sea. And on the top of that butte, he built for himself a palace. In fact, cascading down the north end of it, the north tip of it, is a remarkable series of structures. But the problem is that Masada is situated in the desert. And if you've ever seen pictures of, for instance, well, I don't know, like the Dead Sea and stuff like that, you'll realize quite quickly that you just can't live there. There's no source of water. So Herod did actually a very clever thing. What he did was he took advantage of the fact that during parts of the year, in the springtime part of the year, when there's lots of rain, that you can actually store up water that would overflow from the spring floods and bring them to Masada. So that's what he did. He ended up taking some of the wadis. Sorry for all the movement around. For taking some of the wadis, which are the river valleys that come off of the ridge line of Israel from Jerusalem down to Hebron, and he dammed some of those up, and then he channeled them into aqueducts and steered some of that stormwater in the spring over to the base of Masada, to his rock in the desert. And in these aqueducts, he brought the water over to a series of gigantic holes in the rock, which he had dug out. And these holes in the rock are cisterns. They're cisterns. There were 12 of them on the western side of the base of Masada that were hewn out of solid rock. Now, even though you hew them out of solid rock, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll hold water, because there's cracks in the rock. So they also had to go, after they dug out these gigantic holes in the rock, they'd have to go into the plasterers and plaster over the entire inside of the thing. So it was a gigantic amount of work. In fact, a lot of the rock that was taken out of the cisterns in the Masada, mesa, or whatever you want to call it, was used to construct buildings at the top of the mesa for him and for his horses and just a whole bunch of crazy stuff. At any rate, he made 12 of these cisterns, very large cisterns on the bottom of the mountain that were fed by gravity from aqueducts from spring floods that came down from Jerusalem down to Hebron. And the water would be down there, but that's inaccessible to the people living on top of Masada, where he lived. So then after the spring floods would fill up those cisterns, he'd constantly have servants and donkeys hauling this water up the sides of Masada. And if you see a picture of Masada, that's quite a climb. Constantly, year-round, pulling water up to a larger temporary cistern at the top of the rock that they would actually access. If you ever go to Israel, I got to tell you, if you ever go to Israel, go to Masada. It's an extraordinary place. And you can actually walk into the cistern that's on the top of the mesa of Masada. The ones at the base you don't see very well because they're so far below you. But it is really a pretty remarkable place. At any rate, I want to give you an idea about how big these cisterns are. The cisterns that were gravity-fed from miles away with these aqueducts, 12 of them, 12 or 13, it depends on how you count them, they held so much water that a historian from the past looked at them and said, well, if you calculate how much water is there based on how long it could keep the people alive that were usually up on the top of Masada, which counted about 1,000 during its peak, including servants, household slaves, just tons of people up there. The question is how long can you stay on the top of Masada? Say it was surrounded by an enemy, say it was under siege. And those 1,000 people, based on the size of those cisterns, how long could those people survive in the desert? You do a really quick calculation. 1,000 people, usually daily rations to stay alive is between 2 and 3 gallons a day. If you figure 3 gallons a day for 3,000 people, how many gallons a day is that? 3,000. Well, the cisterns at Masada were 40,000 cubic meters, over 10 million gallons. What I just showed you at the Brigham City pool is only 750,000 gallons. This thing is over 10 to 11 million gallons of water. The 1,000 people that live on the top of Masada, serving Herod and his wonderful summer palace stuff that he does there, those 1,000 people, if they were under siege and consuming only 3 gallons a day, which is enough to stay alive quite easily, they could stay on the top of Masada for 10 years. 10 years of water for 1,000 people. That's how big these things were, 10.5 million gallons. In a real sense, and this is why I'm talking about this so much, why this meme is so important to Jeremiah 2, in a real sense, a cistern is a deliberate attempt to make a man-made structure that can keep you independent of God, that is independent of the rains. Remember, God said when he relocated the Israelites to the top of Israel around Jerusalem, that's actually a ridge line geographically. He said, I don't want you to live near a river like the Nile Delta like you used to live. I want you to live in a place where you'll rely on me for rain all the time, and the blessings of rain will be something you'll enjoy, and they come from me. But when you dig a cistern, what you're saying is, God, I don't want to rely on you anymore. I want to store up my own water. I want to be independent of you. It really does smack of the prodigal son kind of idea. Thank you for all you give me, Father, but I want to be on my own and be apart from you. Thanks for all you provide for me, but I want to do it on my own. So a cistern, just like for Herod, was a way of being independent and disconnected from God and his provision of water. You're doing it yourself. You're storing it up yourself. So think of a cistern from an Old Testament kind of idea as being something that's a supreme man-made attempt to live apart from God. That's a cistern. That's a cistern. So now that brings us to why we're even doing all this setup on this. It's from Jeremiah 2. Let me read it to you because it's a fascinating verse. And now that you know cisterns, you'll get this. Jeremiah, by the way, was a prophet to the nation of Israel when it was really very wayward and had already given up relying on God, not only on a daily basis, but for anything. They had become very independent. So trying to get across the point of how independent they had become, God says this through the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 2:12. God speaking, "Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked. Be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water." So let's go back. And you see what the two sins are. The first sin is that they've given up depending on God for anything. And he says from this water metaphor, when you're camped by living water, and by the way, living water is just a way of saying that the water's moving. That's the Old and New Testament versions of that. Like if you watch old westerns on TV, and you got this guy who's out in the desert and he's crawling on all fours, he's trying to find some water, and he gets finally to some source of water someplace, and you get ready to drink it, and someone warns him, "No, don't drink that, it's bad water." Well, that's what we're talking about, because still water is often bad water, but moving water is living water, and that's the metaphor that he uses right now. He says the number one thing that they've done wrong is that they have denied and gotten rid of their dependence on God, the living waters, the safe water. But then he says the second thing that they did wrong, and this is an astonishing thing, is that they've given up not only the fountain of living water, which is God himself, but they've also decided to replace it with a cistern. Again, the cisterns like we talked about with Herod. Well, Herod's cisterns were a chance at independence from God. So what he's saying right here is that they both built for themselves cisterns. But the sad thing about this story is that the cisterns that man makes to replace a dependence on God are cisterns that are broken. They have cracks in them. And you can work your entire life trying to make yourself independent and investing work in putting water inside these cisterns. But in the end, these cisterns themselves will betray you because they can't hold any water. They just can't hold any water. So that's how it betrays you in the end. The very thing that you invested all your effort and trust into so that you could be independent from God, in the end, betrays you. Now, taking this to a larger level, what he's really saying is that at the large level of mankind was always made to be dependent on a loving God, a creator loving God like a father. And yet, in our sense of rebellion against God, we would rather do it ourselves. We'd rather be independent of God. We'd rather make our own cisterns, invest in it ourselves, draw from it ourselves, not be dependent on God. But the message throughout the entire Old Testament is dependence on God is one of the best ways to live life. In fact, that's what we're made for, and God delights in giving to us. Why would you stiff-arm God and walk away and say, I want to do it on my own, I want to live on my own? And so that's the thrust of Jeremiah 2. My people have done two grave things wrong. They've walked away from me, and in a sense, I'm a fountain of living waters. I'm an endless supply. That's what fountain means. Endless supply of living water. What a horrible choice to make. But then they have substituted me with a cistern, a man-made attempt at independence from God. But unfortunately, in the end, just when you need it the most, you'll discover that the cisterns that you've worked so hard to hew out, that you've worked so hard to fill up, have always been broken, have always been cracked. And when you need them the most, they'll be empty. What a great metaphor for what life independent from God is all about. And this God uses with this well-known meme of cisterns from the Old Testament. Jeremiah 2, verses 12 and 13, take a look at it. The quick application is, so what is it you depend on? Do you depend on God for anything? Or are you sadly independent of God? You tell God all the time, I've got this, I can do this. I mean, where are you in that particular sense? Because dependence on God is not a crux in that particular sense. It's opening up the opportunity for continuous, frequent, daily blessings from God, something that He delights to do for you. So, so consider that. It's fitting I'm going down to a very dry place that has lots of water problems. So I'll tell you more about the water problems when I come back. But on whom do you depend? And here's the question for a lifetime of contemplation on this particular thing. Is your Christian life characterized by growing dependence on God? Growing dependence on God? Or is it characterized by growing independence from God? And that's the big deal. That's the really big deal. God is your Father. He loves you tremendously. He wants to bless you as you depend on Him. Why would you ever walk away from a fountain of living water? Okay, well, I'll see you next week. Have a great week. Pray for us while we're down in Colorado City, and we'll see you next week, and we'll talk about another necessary thing besides water, and that's bread. So we'll see you then next week. God bless.